The sprawling Galactic military academy on the barren planet Cypher was known across the galaxy as a crucible, a place where the strongest, smartest, and most ruthless species were forged into elite soldiers. A cacophony of sounds greeted the new batch of cadets as their shuttle touched down on the dusty landing pad. The air was thick with tension and the heavy presence of veteran instructors, each one a seasoned warrior from one of the many species who inhabited the galaxy. Among the diverse group of new recruits, one stood out: Jackson Cal Turner, a human. At barely 6 feet tall, with average strength and unimpressive features by galactic standards, he looked out of place. The other cadets, towering giants of genetically enhanced warriors, super-intelligent aliens, and even a few bipedal reptilians with scales as thick as armor, sized him up with a mix of curiosity and disdain. These beings had evolved in harsh environments, survived wars that would have wiped out entire species, and thrived in conditions that would kill any human on Earth. The idea that a fragile, emotional human could withstand what they'd been through seemed laughable. Cale stepped off the transport with a stoic expression, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. His eyes flicked to the alien instructors standing at attention, each one a living monument to the galaxy's fiercest warriors. They didn't move, didn't speak. Instead, they observed Cale, waiting for the inevitable fail. Cadet Turner, barked Sergeant Varric, a towering alien with 6 muscular arms, his voice like gravel being ground underfoot. "Do you know where you are?" "I'm here to prove that humanity isn't weak," Cale replied, his tone steady but unyielding. The response drew a few chuckles from the other cadets, but Cale didn't flinch. He knew what was expected of him: failure. They were all waiting for the moment he would break under pressure. What they didn't know, what they couldn't understand, was that Cale had already survived far worse than anything this academy could throw at him. His homeworld, Earth, was a Deathworld, a planet teeming with creatures and environments that actively sought to kill anything that wasn't capable of outsmarting or outrunning death itself. He had grown up fighting for survival, learning to adapt, and never, ever giving up. As Sergeant Varric and the other instructors sized him up, Cale allowed himself a small, knowing smirk. He wasn't here to survive. He was here to show them just what humanity could do. "Welcome to the Academy, Cadet Turner," Varric said with a smirk of his own. "Let's see if you can prove your worth." Cale nodded once, his resolve hardening. This was only the beginning. The first trial was a test of survival in the thick, oppressive jungles of Cypher's moon, a breeding ground for some of the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. The cadets were dropped into the heart of the jungle with only basic survival kits and the barest of instructions. Find the resource cache hidden deep within the jungle, retrieve it, and make it back to the extraction point. The clock was ticking. Each minute lost increased the danger, as deadly predators lurked in the shadows, always watching, always hunting. Cale didn't flinch when the drop pod opened and the humid air hit him. He had been raised in far worse conditions. Earth's jungles had creatures just as lethal, and the wilderness had taught him the one rule that mattered above all: adapt or die. As the other cadets scattered, already shouting orders to each other, Cale paused for a moment, taking in the surroundings. The dense foliage was nearly impenetrable, and the hum of unseen creatures filled the air. He could feel the weight of the predators lurking just beyond his senses. The alien cadets, larger and stronger, moved like bulls through the underbrush, hacking at vines with oversized blades and bellowing to one another. They were arrogant in their speed, their power. They believed brute force would carry them through, just as it had in their homeworlds. But Cale knew better. The jungle wasn't a place for strength. It was a place for the mind. While the others blundered forward, Cale crouched low and began to move in silence. He'd learned the language of the wild from an early age: how to track the smallest footprints, how to sense where the wind was blowing, and how to avoid becoming prey. As he navigated the jungle, he used its natural resources: strong vines for traps, thick branches for cover, and sharp stones to carve tools. His objective wasn't just to find the cache, it was to avoid drawing attention. Hours passed, and the other cadets were either too busy setting up camp or battling the aggressive creatures of the jungle to realize they were losing ground to him. One by one, the bigger, stronger cadets were taken down by the predators. An ambush of clawed raptors here, a surprise strike from venomous serpents there. By the time Cal reached the cache, he was calm, methodical, and unhurried. He didn't take the easy route. Instead of charging in blindly, Cal used his environment to his advantage, silently observing the creatures guarding the cache from a high vantage point. He created a diversion using a loud, echoing noise from a rock slide he triggered on a distant ridge. As the creatures fled toward the sound, Cal slipped into the cache, retrieved the goods, and silently made his way back to the extraction point. When Cal arrived, sweat beading on his forehead, but his movements steady, he looked around to find none of the other cadets had yet returned. The alien instructors who had been watching from afar stood stunned, disbelief written across their faces. They had expected failure, but what they saw instead was the quiet triumph of a human who had outsmarted every beast and survived the jungle's deadliest challenges without firing a single shot. Sergeant Varric stepped forward, his multi-eyed gaze fixed on Cal. His lips curled into a grim smile. "Impressive, Cadet Turner," he said, voice low and unamused. "But let's see how well you fare in the next trial." Cal didn't flinch. This was just the beginning. The next trial was not one for the faint-hearted. It was the Gauntlet, a series of brutal combat simulations designed to test the cadets' ability to fight under pressure, to adapt in real time, and to survive against overwhelming odds. The cadets were thrust into a vast, war-torn arena that shifted its environment every few minutes. Dense urban ruins one moment, an open battlefield the next. The challenge wasn't just to survive. It was to eliminate all opponents while navigating traps, hostile terrain, and the arena's ever-changing chaos. The alien instructors were confident this would be where Cal would falter. They had watched him slip past nature's dangers. But combat was different. It was about raw power, speed, and instinct, the very qualities Cal lacked in comparison to his towering, super-powered peers. The other cadets were equipped with energy weapons, adaptive shields, and other high-tech combat gear. Cal, by contrast, was given only a basic plasma rifle and a set of armor that, to the instructor's amusement, seemed designed more for survival than battle. As the gauntlet began, the arena shifted and chaos erupted. Explosions rumbled in the distance, debris rained down from collapsing structures, and the sounds of distant combat echoed across the battlefield. The alien cadets charged forward, their massive weapons blazing as they dove into the fray, eager to eliminate anything in their path. Cal, however, held back. He didn't rush into the madness. He surveyed the landscape, his sharp eyes scanning for an opening, a weak point in the enemy's formations. The first cadet to engage Cal was a 6-foot-tall Tzethar warrior, a species known for their monstrous physical strength and ferocity. The Tzethar was armed with a massive energy blade, and as it charged, its snarl could be heard from across the arena. Most humans would have panicked at the sight, but Cal didn't even flinch. He let the alien close the gap, his mind working rapidly. The Tzethar swung the energy blade with blinding speed, but Cal was already gone, sliding to the side, using the momentum of the swing to propel himself behind the warrior. In an instant, Cal's plasma rifle was up, and he fired 2 quick, calculated shots into the Tzethar's exposed side. The alien's armor cracked under the blast, and the Tzethar crumpled to the ground with a screech of surprise. Cal didn't celebrate. He turned immediately, scanning for the next threat. Another cadet, a hulking, armored Borathian with 2 massive energy pistols, charged at him from the side. Cal dropped to a crouch, pulling a small explosive charge from his belt. He threw it with surgical precision into a nearby structure, triggering a collapse of debris directly in the Borathian's path. The alien was temporarily blinded and trapped, fumbling to free itself as Kale dashed forward, evading the Borathian's retaliatory fire. Within seconds, Kale was behind the warrior, using his rifle's stun mode to incapacitate the Borathian in a swift, efficient move. The alien instructors, watching from the observation deck, were in stunned silence. One by one, the other cadets fell into the chaos of the gauntlet, some by their own mistakes, others by the deadly environment itself. Kale, however, moved like a shadow, always a step ahead, always thinking 2 moves ahead of his opponents. His every action was deliberate, calculated, and precise, not driven by strength or speed, but by sheer tactical brilliance. By the time the final bell rang and the remaining cadets were called to retreat, Kale was standing, unscathed, amid a battlefield littered with fallen warriors. He hadn't won by overpowering his enemies. He had won by outsmarting them. Sergeant Varric stepped forward again, his gaze narrowed. "Impressive," he said quietly. "But remember, Cadet Turner, survival doesn't always mean victory. Let's see if your mind can hold up in the next trial." Kale nodded, unfazed. This was just another test, and he passed it too. The next trial was unlike anything Kale had faced before, a simulated combat arena designed to push every cadet to their physical and mental limits. The arena was a sprawling, hostile landscape where the environment itself was as much of an enemy as the other cadets. One moment, the terrain was a cracked, post-apocalyptic wasteland, and the next, it shifted into a dense jungle of razor-sharp trees, poisonous fog, and swarming, bioengineered insectoids. The cadets were told nothing about the specific conditions of the trial other than this: survive. Only the strongest will remain. When the bell rang, signaling the beginning of the trial, the cadets rushed into the fray. Most of them relied on brute force and firepower, giant, hulking aliens armed with high-caliber energy weapons, and genetically enhanced superhumans with reflexes faster than light. Kale didn't rush. He never did. He understood the key to survival here was not to fight for the sake of fighting, but to outlast the others, to conserve energy and resources, and to read the terrain before making a move. The first shift in the arena came quickly. The cracked wasteland was replaced by a dense, unnervingly quiet jungle. Towering trees reached up into the smog-choked sky, their leaves sharp as glass. The ground beneath Kale's boots was slick with a mix of rain and slick black mud. He could hear the faint buzz of something moving in the undergrowth, something watching him. A rustle in the distance confirmed what he already knew. He was not alone. He took cover behind a large, jagged rock, watching as the other cadets charged forward, completely unaware of the danger lurking in the foliage. A massive insectoid creature, at least 8 feet tall with chitinous armor and a venomous stinger, emerged from the underbrush, drawn to the sound of the other cadets' reckless movement. The creature snapped its jaws, killing a Tzethar cadet in an instant. The carnage was just beginning. The other cadets turned their attention to the insectoid, thinking it would be an easy kill. The larger cadets fired, their energy blasts lighting up the dark jungle. But the insectoid was faster than any of them had anticipated, darting around trees and using the thick foliage to its advantage. Kale didn't get involved in the initial chaos. Instead, he waited. The battle played out before him like a slow-motion replay, each movement, each shot, each scream unfolding in real time. Kale could see the weaknesses, where the larger cadets' shots were missing, where their armor was weak, where they failed to notice the smaller predators creeping up from behind. His mind worked quickly, picking out the patterns, calculating the most efficient way to navigate the madness. It wasn't until the creature charged toward a group of cadets directly in front of him that Kale made his move. He darted out of cover, moving low and fast, as the insectoid attacked a hulking Borathian with a rapid thrust of its stinger. The Borathian fell with a howl, leaving the creature distracted for just a moment. Kale used that opening to move behind it, firing a single shot into the back of its skull. A direct hit. The creature collapsed instantly, its massive body crashing to the ground. Kale didn't stop to admire his work. He slipped back into the shadows before any other cadets could notice him. The survival arena was more than a test of strength or skill. It was a test of patience and timing. And Kale knew that while the others were busy killing each other and battling the creatures, his best weapon was the one thing they hadn't accounted for: his ability to survive by remaining unseen, unnoticed, and patient. As the environment shifted again, this time to a thick, poisonous fog, Kale took a deep breath and moved forward. He was still standing, still alive, and while the other cadets struggled to adapt to the rapidly changing environment, he was already thinking 2 steps ahead. He wasn't just going to survive this trial, he was going to win it. Sergeant Varrick's voice boomed over the arena's loudspeakers. "Survival means more than brute force, Cadet Turner. But can you endure the next test?" Cal's eyes narrowed. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about winning. And he was ready. The next trial was one that Cal had expected, though he wasn't sure if he'd be ready for it. Leadership, while surviving the hostile environments and defeating deadly opponents, had proven his worth in the eyes of the instructors. This test would show them if he could lead others. The cadets were split into squads, each with a mix of alien species. Their task: lead a team through a high-risk, high-stakes assault on an enemy stronghold. At first glance, Cal's squad appeared to be the weakest. His team consisted of a skittish, young Selenar scout, a gruff Catharn warrior with a history of insubordination, and a severely injured Ngari medic. The other squads were far more intimidating: huge, armored cadets, all bred for combat and eager to prove their dominance. They had the numbers, the firepower, and most importantly, the confidence that their strength alone would win the day. Sergeant Varrick's voice rang out across the comms. "Your mission: infiltrate the enemy stronghold, disable their primary weapon systems, and retrieve the intelligence hidden within their command center. You have 1 hour. If you fail, you will not survive." Kale took a deep breath as the squad readied for the mission. He didn't have the luxury of relying on overwhelming strength like the other squads. His cadets were broken, scared, wounded, and untrained for the stakes. But Kale knew something they didn't. Leadership wasn't about imposing strength. It was about trust. And for that, he needed to believe in them, just as much as they needed to believe in him. The squad made their way toward the stronghold, sticking to the shadows and avoiding detection. The Catharn warrior, Rogar, was a loose cannon. He constantly wanted to charge in, guns blazing, while Kale kept him on track. "Hold back," Kale would tell them, voice steady but firm. "Let them make the first move." The Selenar scout, Tessa, was nervous, her hand shaking as she keyed into the enemy's security systems. I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. Kale crouched beside her, his voice calm. "Tessa, you've been trained for this. Trust yourself. You're not alone." As the mission progressed, the squad encountered an ambush. Rogar and the medic, Vorn, were pinned down by enemy fire. The Catharn's shield was cracking under the pressure, and the medic couldn't reach him in time to patch him up. The mission was on the verge of failure. But Kale didn't panic. Instead, he dropped to his knees, pulling out a small EMP charge from his pack. "Cover me," he said to Tessa, who hesitated for a moment before nodding. With the EMP planted, Kale sprinted back to the squad, hearing the distant sound of enemy forces approaching. The device detonated, knocking out the enemy's power grid, causing a temporary blackout. "Move now," Kale shouted. They stormed the stronghold, using the confusion to their advantage. Rogar took out the guards with precise shots, while Kale and Tessa moved toward the command center. Despite the odds, the squad followed Cal's lead without question. No hesitation, no second guessing. When they reached the command center, Kale was the first to enter, keeping the momentum flowing as they retrieved the intel. As they made their way back to the extraction point, the enemy launched a final counterattack. But this time, they were ready. The squad fought with discipline and unity, holding their ground until the dropship arrived. When they boarded, Kale looked at each of them, Tessa, Rogar, and Vorn, and realized something profound. They weren't just following orders. They were trusting him. When the mission was complete, and the squad returned to the academy, Sergeant Varric and the other instructors stood waiting. Kel's squad had completed the mission with fewer casualties than any other team. But what mattered most wasn't the result. It was the way Kel had held them together through it all. Sergeant Varric was silent for a long moment before he spoke. Cadet Turner, you don't lead through fear. You lead through trust. This is why you survived. And why they followed. Kale didn't respond. He didn't need to. The next trial awaited. And Kale was ready for whatever came next. The final trial was a mission of unparalleled danger. A full-scale assault on a heavily fortified enemy citadel, a place where war criminals and insurrectionists were held in a high-security prison. The alien surgeons were sure this would be the moment Kel's limits would be exposed. The other cadets, powerful and enhanced beyond the capabilities of any human, would have no trouble breezing through the trial. They were equipped with advanced weaponry, shields, and combat drones. Kale, on the other hand, was armed with a basic plasma rifle, a few grenades, and a suit of light armor that barely withstood the trial's first engagement. The enemy citadel was a fortress of black iron and energy shields, perched on a jagged cliff face with high walls and towering defenses. The cadets were told to breach the outer walls, disable the citadel's power core, and capture any high-ranking officers. There would be no mercy for failure. The planet's surface was crawling with automated turrets, drone patrols, and genetically engineered war beasts. Every part of the citadel was designed for maximum defense. The alien surgeons made it clear that brute strength, firepower, and speed were the only tools that mattered here. No one had expected Kel to make it this far, least of all Sergeant Varric, who regarded the human with cold, calculating eyes. "Do not disappoint me, Cadet Turner," Varric had said, his voice devoid of hope or belief. "Survival doesn't mean success." Kel's squad, though battle-worn and tired, stood firm. They had already proven themselves in the field. Tessa, the Selenar scout, had become a crack shot, quick and quiet in her movements. Rogar, the Catharn warrior, was brimming with confidence after the last mission, though Kale still kept him in check. Vorn, the Ngari medic, was recovering from his earlier injuries, but his grit and resourcefulness made him invaluable. They landed on the outskirts of the citadel, the massive walls looming over them. The ground trembled as automated turrets whirred to life, targeting their shuttle. Before they could even disembark, energy beams lit up the sky, slamming into their landing site. The squad scattered, taking cover behind debris, while Kel assessed their options. The easy route would be to charge the front gates, but Kel knew better. They had no chance of surviving an all-out assault. It would be a slaughter. "Rogar, take out the perimeter drones," Kel ordered. The Catharn grunted but followed the command, his heavy blaster cracking the silence as he fired upon the hovering drones with pinpoint accuracy. The other cadets moved quickly, clearing out the first wave of automated defenders. "Vorn, Tessa, stay low. Cover the entrances. I'll disable the power grid," Kel instructed. "Understood," Tessa whispered, already slipping into position. The squad advanced under the cover of smoke and debris, moving silently across the compound's outer rim. The citadel's defenses were formidable, but Kel had studied the structure. He knew the weak points, where the turrets would be blind, where the walls could be breached. He led them to a back entrance, using his knowledge of engineering and tactics to bypass security systems. Each move was deliberate, every decision calculated. Once inside, the real test began. The citadel's corridors were dark and winding, filled with armed guards and high-tech security measures. The squad moved cautiously, dispatching guards swiftly and quietly. Kel led from the front, guiding his team through the twisting hallways, staying a step ahead of any ambushes. His mind was a constant calculation. If they were spotted, they would be overwhelmed. They reached the heart of the citadel, the power core, surrounded by reinforced walls and a detachment of elite guards. Kale knew this would be the hardest part. There was no room for error. As they breached the final door, all hell broke loose. Laser fire erupted from all sides as the squad fought their way toward the power core. Rogar's blaster was relentless, cutting down enemies in seconds. Tessa picked off guards from long range, her aim deadly accurate. But just as they reached the core, the ground shook violently. The citadel was going into lockdown. The walls hummed with energy, sealing off escape routes. The squad was trapped. Kale looked around, calculating. Vorn set the charges. Kale commanded, "Tessa, cover him. Rogar, with me." As Vorn planted the explosives on the core, the alarms blared, and the entire citadel began to shift, readying for self-destruction. They had mere minutes before it detonated. Kale led the charge, clearing the final guards with ruthless efficiency. As the timer counted down, the squad made its way back toward the extraction point. Cal's heart raced, not from fear, but from a singular burning drive. Asterisk, they would escape, or they would die trying asterisk. The squad, battered and exhausted, reached the extraction point with seconds to spare. The massive doors slid open, and Kale led his team into the waiting shuttle. The citadel erupted behind them, a fiery explosion lighting up the sky. They had done it. The mission had been a success, and the alien surgeons, watching from their distant posts, were left to wonder just how a human, so small and seemingly out of place, had led a team of the galaxy's finest soldiers to victory. As the shuttle ascended into the sky, Kale looked out over the burning remains of the citadel. The trials were over, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't done yet. The academy had always been a place of rigid structure, of discipline, and of survival. But as Kale and his squad celebrated their hard-earned victory in the trials, they were about to discover just how fragile the peace between them and their fellow cadets truly was. The lessons learned in the fire of battle were about to be tested once again, but this time, in a way they could never have predicted. It began with an unexpected mission. Late one night, the cadets were summoned for a new assignment, one they hadn't anticipated. Sergeant Varric and several high-ranking officers convened in the briefing room, their faces grave. "Cadet Turner," Varric began, his voice more serious than Kel had ever heard it. "You and your squad are to embark on a covert mission. We have intel that an enemy faction, one that's been working from within the academy, has begun sabotaging our efforts. This could compromise everything. You are to infiltrate their ranks, discover who is responsible, and eliminate the threat." Cal's stomach tightened. Betrayal within the ranks was one of the worst things that could happen in a place like this. The trust they had built, both between them and the instructors, and between each other, was about to be tested in ways that went beyond physical strength or strategy. This was a mission of trust and deception. Kale, Rogar, Tessa, and Vorn stood together as they received their orders. The mission was simple in theory: root out the traitor, report back, and neutralize them. But the deeper Kale dug into the mission brief, the more uneasy he became. Something didn't sit right. It was too easy, too clean. "We'll do this carefully," Kale said as he glanced at his squad. "We don't know who the traitor is, but we need to trust each other. If anyone is compromised, we deal with it. Together." Rogar grunted in agreement, his massive arms folding across his chest. "I don't care who the traitor is. No one messes with my squad." But as they infiltrated the academy's hidden sectors, Cal's doubts began to grow. There was an odd tension in the air, like something was waiting to snap. They moved through the shadows, their movements silent, but every turn felt like they were being watched. The squad reached the designated target zone, a high-security data vault deep within the academy's lower levels. It was here that the traitor's identity was supposed to be uncovered. But when they accessed the vault's terminal, a sudden alarm blared. The doors slammed shut, locking them in. It was a trap, asterisk, and they were the bait, asterisk. Cal's mind raced as he scanned the now compromised data, realizing with horror that the mission briefing wasn't just a ruse. It had been designed to draw them in, to expose them to something far darker than they could have imagined. They weren't here to uncover a traitor. They were being framed. I knew something didn't feel right, Cal muttered, his pulse quickening. As the trap closed around them, figures stepped out of the shadows, cloaked in dark uniforms. They were cadets, familiar faces from earlier trials. Cal's stomach dropped as he recognized them. The very cadets who had once mocked him, who had underestimated him. And now, they were the ones betraying the academy. "We've been waiting for you, Cadet Turner," one of them sneered. It was Zakar, a former squad leader from a rival team. "You really thought you could lead your team to victory. You've been nothing but a pawn in a game much larger than you." Cal's fists clenched, but he remained calm. His squad was cornered, the odds stacked against them. His mind raced, calculating their next move. The traitors had the upper hand, but Cal had learned a valuable lesson in survival. It wasn't over until the last move was made. "I don't care about your game, Zakar," Cal said coldly, stepping forward. "But I'm not going down without a fight. And neither is my squad." Before the traitors could react, Cal's hand shot out to a nearby console, overriding the security lockdown with his own personal code, one he'd never shared with anyone. The vault's doors hissed open, and Cal's squad sprang into action. Tessa fired first, taking down one of the attackers with a pinpoint shot to the head. Rogar, his muscles bulging, swung into battle with a roar, taking out two of the traitors with brutal efficiency. Vorn, though still injured, didn't hesitate. He threw himself into the fray, using his medical tools as makeshift weapons to incapacitate an assailant. In the chaos, Cal locked eyes with Zakar, the traitor who had orchestrated this entire trap. Zakar was sneering, thinking victory was in his grasp. But Cal was already 10 steps ahead. With a swift, calculated move, Cal knocked Zakar's weapon aside and disarmed him, pinning him to the ground. "You don't get to win," Cal said, his voice steady, cold as steel. "Not today." As the rest of Zakar's team fell or retreated, Cal's squad stood victorious. But the realization hit hard. The academy, the trials, everything they had fought for, it wasn't as simple as it seemed. The galaxy was full of enemies, and trust was a currency that could be bought, sold, or shattered in an instant. And Cal Turner knew that this betrayal was just the beginning of a much bigger war. The aftermath of the betrayal was swift. Cal's squad had neutralized the traitor cadets, but the damage done to their trust was deeper than any physical wound. The academy's halls, once filled with a strange mix of awe and disdain for the human cadet, now whispered a new story. Cal Turner, the human who led a squad through insurmountable odds, and the one who had exposed the traitors within their ranks. When Sergeant Varric and the Academy's council arrived at the scene of the attack, they were silent, their eyes flicking between Cal and the fallen cadets. The traitors had been sent to capture Cal and his squad, to test them, or worse, to make an example of them. But Cal had proven himself not only in strength, but in resolve. He had led his squad through the ultimate test, asterisk the test of trust asterisk. "Cadet Turner," Varric finally said, his voice softer than usual, though his expression remained stoic. "You've done more than uncover a betrayal. You've ensured that your squad survives this war, and the Academy along with it. For that you've earned something far greater than respect. You've earned a place among the stars." Cal nodded, but the weight of those words didn't sink in right away. His eyes turned to his squad, to the faces that had stood by him through every trial, every battle. Rogar, Tessa, and Vorn. They weren't just his teammates anymore. They were his family, bound not by blood, but by the trust they had forged under fire. The Academy's instructors made their own report, but the Council soon realized something far more troubling. Zakhar's group was only one piece of a much larger plot, an organized insurgency that had infiltrated many of the galaxy's most elite academies. They were breeding resentment against the growing human presence in the galaxy's power structures, and their intent was nothing less than sabotage and chaos. The mission Cal had thought was a simple trial was only the beginning. The galaxy itself was at war with forces that operated in the shadows. Sergeant Varak's voice interrupted Cal's thoughts. "You've learned the most important lesson of all, Cadet Turner. Asterisk survival doesn't just depend on strength or skill. It depends on the will to endure the hardest of tests and come out standing." Cal took a deep breath. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The truth about the insurgency would come to light in time, and his squad would be the first line of defense. But there was something more Cal understood now. Humanity's place in the galaxy was no longer uncertain. The trials were finished. The blood had been spilled, but Cal Turner had made sure of one thing. Humanity was no longer the underdog. They were a force to be reckoned with. As the instructors left the briefing room and the doors closed behind him, Cal turned to his squad. "We've got a lot more to do. The galaxy doesn't know what's coming for it. But I promise you this, we're not backing down." Rogar slapped Cal on the back, grinning. "We don't back down. Not ever." Tessa smiled, her eyes gleaming with pride. "I trust you, Cal. You've earned it." Vorn, the quiet medic, simply nodded. "Let's finish this. The galaxy may have underestimated humanity, but Cal Turner and his squad were living proof that sometimes the smallest spark could ignite a fire that would burn through everything in its path." And as Cal looked out at the stars beyond the Academy's walls, he knew one thing for certain. The true war had just begun. And humanity was ready.